Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar in which we'll be exploring the changes happening surrounding IR35 legislation. I'm Matteo, the Senior Principal Consultant at Consultancy Plus, and I lead our technology practice here. Today we'll be equipping you to understand the legislation and its changes, understanding the CEST tool, which is the check employment status for tax tool, exploring your possibility options, and then we'll wrap up with a 15 minutes Q&A. So please, if you have any questions crop up throughout the webinar, do make a note of them and we can provide you with some clarity. As I said, please, any questions you have into the chat and we'll get them lifted straight onto this session and they'll feed into the Q&A towards the end. So this webinar will be delivered jointly by Consultancy Plus and Reed Technology. So thank you to everyone in Reed Technology for inviting us to host this session. I'm sure you all know Reed, but you may not have come across Consultancy Plus before. We are the consulting and project delivery arm of Reed, and surrounding IR35 in particular, we've supported clients to manage the change in the public sector from 2017 and in the private sector since the announcement in the 2018 budget. So this webinar signals the beginning of our IR35 series, including the launch of a website dedicated to providing you with the information you need to start to manage these legislation changes. The dedicated site will feature plenty of really informative content designed specifically for this purpose, including a selection of 90-second videos deep diving into the key areas. So today's webinar lays the foundation of an extremely complex subject area. So to build on the information from today, please do go and check out the website, and we hope you enjoy and find the content useful. We'll make sure the link is available to everyone in due course. So on to the speakers now. A panel of brilliant minds this morning, delivering a wealth of excellent content on the webinar today. I have with me Richard Smith, who is our partner at Consultancy Plus and Director of Business Transformation, Steve Dilley, Managing Consultant for HR Transformation and Change, and James Bridgland, Consulting Director. So here's an overview of how the session will work and what to expect. It will be very interactive. I've prepped each of the panel with a couple of questions to chat through. So they're going to share some informative content with you. I will then ask them some follow-up questions. Like I said, feel free to add any questions into the chat box, which is being monitored as we go on to the webinar. And it's also worth giving the panel a hard time whilst we have them here. And we'll then look to share some of the data insights from the questions we asked during the sign-up process as well. So kicking off, I think it's worth giving everyone a brief overview of what's changing. Richard, I'm going to come to you on this shortly. However, before I do, I wanted to share the outcomes of a LinkedIn Pulse survey that we did last week. We asked the question, do you think that your organization understands IR35? And the results, we found that 58% of companies reported that they didn't understand the legislation well at all. So if you may fall into this category, you're not the only one, and this is just the start. Understanding the legislation is key, but as organizations, it's what you do with this understanding when implementing a strategy that will see the difference between compliance and non-compliance. So Richard, a good time to bring you in to shed some light on things. How can we go about understanding the changes, please?
Thanks, Matteo. So I'm going to take you through a slide deck now. If you could bring that up, that would be great. So basically, IR35 is tax legislation. It's not new. It's been around since the year 2000. So we've had just over 20 years of it now. The idea is it's meant to find out if somebody is regarded as being what HMRC would describe as a disguised employee. So if you looked at two people working alongside each other, are they doing more or less the same role? And if they are, they should pay roughly the same amount of tax. And that's what the legislation's designed to do. So it's, as I say, it's not the legislation itself isn't changing much. It's really who applies it and how it's applied. So back in April 2017, a key change was made. So in the public sector, clients now need to make a determination of whether somebody is inside or outside IR35, and up till then, and it's still the case in the private sector, a contractor will make that decision. So that's the key change, is that it's who makes the decision about whether the legislation applies or not. Once you made a decision, the client must now pass on that status determination to both an agency if they work with the agency, but the contractor as well. So they need to pass on a status determination. Once they've had that status determination, the contractor will have, in the new legislation, it's not actually been in the public sector, but it is for the private sector legislation, the option of making a challenge to the decision. So a client will need to make sure that they have a status determination challenge process in place where you can effectively review the decision when the contractor challenges it. If a contractor is determined to be inside IR35, the key change is that you can no longer pay that contractor gross. So at the moment, people will pay a limited company gross if they submit their invoice. If it's determined they're inside IR35, you can no longer do that. If the person still wants to work through the limited company and you're happy to allow that, you would need to make tax deductions prior to paying the contractor and then pay those deductions across to HMRC. So there's a cost implication there, not only for the contractor, but also for the agency or the client that's engaged in the contractor potentially as well. And the final point is that if you get this wrong, liability can move back to the end client for the status determination. So it's really important that you're aware of what your supply chain is doing, and if you're engaging agencies, that they are applying the determination you've given them correctly. Otherwise, that liability can potentially move back to you if HMRC can't recover it from the agency. So that's just a really quick overview of the legislation. I thought I'd just quickly take you through some of the myths that surround IR35, because there are quite a few. So the first one there is whether a business might still be liable if they've made the CEST determination or use the CEST test to make the determination. And the answer to that is false. So HMRC have said that if you use the CEST test, they will stand by the outcome of the test. What's key is that you get the inputs correct. So as long as you use it, you should be safe. The next one is that, if you just bring that up for me. So if a business deliberately misleads an agency on the IR35 status, can that tax risk go back to the end client? Well, the answer to that is true. So it's really important that you answer any test that you do correctly, otherwise that tax liability can come back to you. And then also, as I've already mentioned, if an agency does apply tax incorrectly, basically that liability can come back to you. So it's false that it won't come back to you through the supply chain. And the final one there is that you must advise clients about the IR35 status. That's true. So that's going to be in the legislation that if you are using limited company contractors, you will have a duty to inform the agency of the IR35 status of that contractor. There's just a few more to cover here as well. So the first one there is if a business categorises the role as being inside IR35 and the contractor still wants to work through the limited company, would they get employment rights? And that's false. So HMRC have made it very clear that if somebody keeps operating through a limited company, they won't acquire any employment rights, because obviously they're employed by their own limited company still. And then this one really is just a bit of a myth that's out there, that if you use a consultancy arrangement, that would automatically take you outside IR35. Well, that's false. So consultancy itself will not take you outside IR35. We'll talk a bit more in detail about that, but that's something to watch out for, that someone telling you, don't worry, this is a consultancy arrangement, we don't have to worry about R35, well, that's false. You still have to consider it. And the same actually applies to statement of works as well, which is the next one. So statement of works itself will not take you outside R35. It's really important that you make sure that if you are using a statement of works, that what's in the statement of work is actually followed. And then the last one there is that the rules do not apply to small agencies. So that's false. So there is a condition in the legislation that the rules only apply to large and medium-sized organisations. and that would include small agencies, but some agencies are still a little bit confused and thinking because they're small it doesn't apply to you. So they're the key myths and a quick overview of the legislation for you, Matteo.
Thanks, Richard. That's great information. So how do you think the changes will impact us?
So I think the main thing we'll see is the market moving in two very sort of different directions. So there'll be clients that decide that they're not going to employ people through limited companies anymore, and we've seen that particularly with some of the banks where they said that they only engage people on a POI only basis. And the second kind of thing that's happening is that if you are going to engage people through the limited company, a lot of people are now considering doing that through statement of works to make sure that it's very clear what the arrangement is, and if the role is found to be outside IR35, that it stays outside IR35. So you are seeing there's two very different routes now. So either saying no to limited companies, or if you are, trying to manage them in a better way.
Thanks, Richard. I hear one or two people doubting the government's resolve, so it's probably necessary to give some clarity around that. Will this actually be going ahead in April 2021?
I wouldn't bet my house on it, but I'd say I'm 99% certain it will go ahead. The reason for that is that it's now in the legislation, so it received royal assent, so it's now part of the legislation, whereas previously there's been this kind of to and fro about whether it would actually go into the legislation or not. So it is there now, and I think the other second factor is that the government's going to be desperate for the tax take. They were before, and even so more now with COVID and everything that's going on. So I'm certain it will go ahead.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. So the next thing I want to give you an insight on is the CEST tool itself, as this is the government's way of making determinations around IR35. So Steve, can you give us a run through of how the tool works and what it's looking to achieve, please?
Sure. Thanks, Matteo. So as we mentioned already, the CEST tool is HMRC's online test, which you can use to assess the IR35 status of a role, so giving you that inside or outside determination. And the legislation itself doesn't actually require you to use the tool. However, a lot of organisations will be for at least some part of their process. Now, I would point out that this is mainly because, as Richard said, HMRC will stand by the outcome, providing you've shown reasonable care in answering the questions, and not necessarily because it's a fantastic tool. So how does it work? I'm going to bring up a simple process flow on the slide here, which shows you the key areas of the CEST tool and how they work together to produce a determination. So the first area, as you can see from here, is substitution. So this is specifically whether or not the client has the right to reject a worker substitute. So it also looks at whether substitution is occurring or whether it's just replacement. Secondly, the test looks at direction and control. This section is all about whether the client can tell the contractor what to do, how to do it, and when or where to do it. So James will explore some of the tools like statement of work that you can use to keep a project on track without actually necessarily controlling the contractor. So the third section is the contractor's level of financial risk that they are undertaking in doing the work. So this includes examining the irrecoverable costs of the work, other sunk costs they might have, and how they're actually paid for the work. So is it a day rate or a fixed price or another form of payment? So it's really important to remember here that being paid a fixed price or on delivery doesn't automatically mean financial risk is taken on. The contractor must incur extra costs to put anything right, and that's not just losing the opportunity to do further work. So the final area of the CEST looks at the contractor's kind of integration into the organisation. So this covers off things like mutuality of obligation, examining whether there is an expectation of further work beyond the current contract. So as you can see from this slide, this simplified logic, that there are three outcomes. So you've got IR35 does not apply, which means outside IR35, IR35 applies, which means inside, and then also undetermined, which is a result that comes out, which isn't hugely helpful. But it's worth noting from the logic here that only one of those first three key areas that I mentioned needs to be satisfied to achieve an outside IR35 result. So that's a bit of a common misconception where you might hear, oh, we don't accept substitution, so therefore it must be inside IR35. That's not necessarily the case. As you can see here, you might not accept substitution, but actually you have no direction and control over that resource. So IR35 might then not apply. So although this looks quite simple, for anyone who's looked at the CEST, there are obviously lots of different questions within each of these areas. So unfortunately, it's not as simple as it appears here. However, hopefully this gives a good steer on what the tool is looking to achieve.
Thanks, Steve. That was really useful. Thank you. Some of the audience, while signing up, have asked about some examples where you have seen substitution work in practice.
So this is a really important point to draw upon. It's really easy, as you can see from this logic, if you say you accept substitution, then it's outside IR35, regardless of what you put into the rest of the test. So it's really easy for you to kind of get hold of this test, say, yes, we accept substitution, and they're outside. And then actually all the other things might point to it being an employment relationship. So if that is the case, you've got to be really certain that you're not able to reject a substitute and that you can stand by that answer. So substitution can be a really tricky one because in theory, it sounds very doable. It sounds simple. However, when you ask the question of yourselves, when has this actually happened? It might be quite difficult to pinpoint exactly if it's even occurred, let alone evidence that you do not have that right to reject the substitute. But from an IR35 perspective, substitution is a really great indicator of whether you're dealing with an individual and possible employee or a business. So looking at some practical examples, there's the classic example of hiring someone to come along and fix the roof on your house, where what they may do is bring in a substitute to undertake different parts of the job. So the tiling, for instance. So here you've clearly contracted with one individual. However, they are acting like a business and they will pay any of the resources that they use to do some of the work. So in a more of a kind of professional services setting, a technology business that Matteo works for has used substitution effectively on a variety of different projects. So in particular, we were using limited company contractors on a transformation program with the police force, and our lead architect was able to substitute and use resources from their network. So they brought in a specialist and paid the specialist for a certain piece of work, which actually enabled faster delivery of the overall outcome. So aside from substitution occurring here in line with IR35, we were actually able to benefit from access to specialist skills from a consultant's network. So facilitating this kind of process is something you might want to consider so you can actually realise further benefits, not just IR35 related. So this touches on some of the positive aspects of IR35 and how you can improve your engagement of flexible resources, which James will build upon a little later in the webinar.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Steve. Another question is around financial risk. How do you quantify some of these terms like significant expense?
So this is one of the major grey areas of the CEST. So thanks for highlighting that one. It's one where you'll find that contractors, and I'm really sorry if there are any in the audience, will likely be armed with a good defence and be able to justify why they are taking on significant risk. So it's worth understanding what HMRC actually mean by terms like significant expense. So this depends on the value of the contract firstly. However, it's an expense that's likely to make up a significant proportion of the contract value. Over 40% is a figure that we've seen HMRC use. So they specifically say that costs a worker chooses to incur through personal preference are not relevant, and everyday items that a worker might use for both work or personal reasons, such as laptops and phones, are not indicative of significant expense. So something that comes up quite often when we go through this with customers is driving to work and hotels and other transport and subsistence payments. So this all boils down to two things. So firstly, are they required for the role? So if it's required because the worker is based in another part of the country, that is not typically seen as required for the role. The worker could move closer to the role, or the hirer could use a worker who was based closer. And secondly, if they are a requirement for the role, do they make up a significant expense, as we've just discussed? So from my experience, this question, or these questions around significant expense, are quite a high bar to clear. So more often than not, we see the answers mainly going to be no. The instances where there are examples of something that constitutes significant expense may give you a bit of an idea of what HMRC means. So some of the examples you could say would be, for instance, a lorry driver who has to go out and buy a lorry for the work, and that's not compensated for by their clients, or specialist equipment that a photographer has to get. So things like that. If you're hearing things like I need to pay for a qualification, or I need to get a laptop, that's not in the significant expense kind of area that HMRC view. So one final thing to note on this, which hopefully is a good point you can take forward. The organisations that we've seen do this section of the test well have always defined in practical terms what it means for that organisation. So they have certain standards and examples in place to define what significant expense is. So instead of answering, does the contractor incur significant expense, they're answering, has the contractor evidenced direct costs for this engagement over a certain monetary value? So what this does is add clarity and consistency to how you answer each section of the CEST.
Perfect, thank you, Steve. And finally, how have you seen organisations approach determinations in terms of who is responsible for doing it?
So we've seen a variety of approaches with this. So from companies who've left it to hiring managers to undertake determinations, through to a central team or an individual person doing all of the determinations with no input from anyone external. So this is often defined or determined by the amount of contractors you have, the internal resource constraints, and even the risk tolerance of the organisation. But I'd say there's a few really important things to consider when setting out who and how determinations are made. So how will you ensure consistency across all of your roles? How will you demonstrate reasonable care? So that really important point of getting the inputs right. How will you ensure working practices, so what actually happens, is reflected in the CEST determination? And then finally, what will be your approach to those undetermined results that we've seen can happen? So organisations that we've seen do this really effectively have achieved that right blend of having a central team to control and add consistency, but also getting good buy-in and input from the hiring managers, making sure it reflects the working practices, but also getting their steer on what actually happens on the ground. One thing that's really important is the consistency, and actually communicating how you've interpreted the legislation to ensure fairness and honesty across all engagements. So that's really important. We've seen organisations who kind of applied it maybe inconsistently, and that's where you're kind of running into danger of starting to fall foul of the legislation. So finally, just to finish on one further point, I think a little bit of flexibility and open-mindedness can really help. Listening to others' views is important, as the CEST and kind of making IR35 determinations is a pretty grey area. So you want to take opinions on board, be open-minded, and then you may actually find out some things that you might not have previously considered.
Great, thank you very much, Steve. So at this point, I wanted to share some of the results from the information that you all shared when you registered for the event. So we asked the question, what stage is your organisation at in terms of readiness for the changes? The outcomes were really interesting, actually. It seems only 6% have already implemented a plan, 7% have a plan drafted but need to pull together external solutions to get this plan moving. And most interestingly of all, that leaves 87% without a plan. Bearing in mind the date of April 2021, IR35 will almost definitely rise rapidly in terms of organisation priorities. What I find most interesting in this data set is the 42% understand but no plan of action. It would be interesting to delve into this to identify where this is down to internal motivation or stems from a lack of certainty around the understanding already in place. But anyway, let's refocus back to the content at hand. So following on from that, now is a really good time to bring in James Bridgland in to understand the options open to organizations to manage these changes. So James, part of what you do is prep organizations to manage this. So what are the key steps, do you think, to tackling this?
Thank you, Matteo. I think the first key one is you kind of need to know where you are. I think sometimes organizations that we've worked with have looked at this, have run it a bit early, and they've started to think about what solutions are available, how to manage it without kind of knowing where you are. So I think the really first basic step, and the thing that we look at first when we're doing this, is to try and get a gauge for your own position or the position of your organization. So things like how many in-scope engagements do you have? That clearly limits the options you have as to what you can do. How are you managing those engagements at the moment? So if you were to look at doing a determination on some of those engagements, where would they sit? Would they sit inside and outside? Because that gives you a view as to what problem you're looking to solve. One of the critical things is when those engagements end, because that gives you a lot of options. If actually a lot of your engagements end prior to the regulations changing, then that gives you a cleaner break to decide on what you want to do and how to manage some of those, and also kind of with those projects and engagements, how critical are they and what budgets are aligned to them. So if you can get a feel for where you are as an organization, you can then jump on to start thinking about kind of how to manage that based on your own preferences. So there are some basic options that are around, people talk about. So whether that's you could stop engaging PSCs altogether. You've got to consider what you do with any you have in flight. But certainly going forward for any new engagement you take in, you can make the decision. You can look at increasing your permanent headcount to cover that expertise and that resource. You could look at outsourcing options. I think there are some very good approaches to that. I think you have to be careful of taking too drastic a step just to ensure you're compliant with the legislation. There are probably better ways to achieve that, I would say. But there are a whole heap of different options, and I think there are pros and cons to each of those options, and it's very much a case of understanding what you need and what your challenges are, so that you can understand which option works best for you. And I think it's probably worth mentioning as well that it's not non-compliant to have engagements sit outside of IR35. It does sometimes come to a situation where people feel like, oh, we've got some outside engagements, it's not quite compliant, we're not doing the right thing. But it's perfectly legitimate not only to have outside engagements, but to continue to grow those and continue to engage PSCs. You just need to do so in a way that's compliant and effective. And we actually have quite a few of the clients we work with, or organizations that we work with, they look to, or looking for the private sector and for the public sector stuff, looks to use this to drive a cultural change. I think sometimes professional services, consultancy projects has been a bit murky, and organisations have lacked visibility over it, and it's not necessarily driven the right behaviours in the way that population is being engaged. Whereas this is a real opportunity for some organisations to get some control over that. And I actually think some of the things that have happened with the pandemic and with COVID have sped up that urgency. You know, you've got more, typically organisations have more people working remotely. That control over working hours and working location has significantly relaxed in the last 9 months. So there's a big focus on looking at how to manage more effectively towards outcomes rather than time and location. So what's being delivered and where. You know, looking at control options around IR35 can help to do that, ensuring you get what you pay for. I think most organisations, they don't necessarily have an aversion to paying for a niche and specialist skill set. What they have an aversion to is paying for that skill set to run on and on and be there for longer than they're supposed to be, and kind of not getting value for money in that. but looking at effective IR35 management solutions can help you get to that place where you are having greater control over what you pay for. In addition, it can certainly, moving forward, could really open up some access to some more niche, talented skill sets and skill pools if managed correctly. So I think there are a lot of options in how you look to manage the approach. They all hinge on understanding where you are as an organization, as a company or business, and from that point you can start to think about what works best for you. But so there's no one right approach to this, and there's no one way that everyone's going to do, and every process that you go through that everyone will go through that will come out with the same answer. It's very dependent on kind of your own or your organization's situation. Does that answer your question, Dave? I hope that helps.
Yep, thank you very much, James. Can you share some examples of this, or the types of models that people are using to do this and the pitfalls?
Sure. I think the models to do it, it's not probably model is sometimes the wrong word. It's approaches, and it doesn't. For a lot of organisations, it's probably worth saying that it may not need to change very much. You just might need to undertake a determination, and actually what you're doing right now might be perfectly fine to carry on doing. You might want some more checks and balances in place. In terms of the approaches available and the different ways you can go about ensuring compliance and those checks and balances, I think there's a range from, as I said, that blanket let's all stop using PSCs and contractors entirely through to let's outsource and offshore everything. I think that option of stopping working with PSCs from a risk management point of view, if you can have that break whereby from April onwards you don't have any PSCs in your organisation, that does manage that risk, because with no PSCs comes no requirement to do a determination, comes no IR35 liability. But it does have operational, commercial, delivery implications from doing that. But what I would say is a lot of organisations took that stance to say not only no direct engagement of PSCs, but no PSCs through the supply chain. A lot of organisations did take that decision and carried pushing that decision through, even when things were delayed last April. And to say to some of the scaremongers out there who said that would never work, actually I haven't come across too many organisations who have had drastic issues with that. They've had some bits that have sat outside of that decision, but they've managed those in isolation and with control. I think there's a lot of organisations looking at do we move to a more permanent or fixed term contract type model, which for a lot of engagements in a lot of areas can work very well. I think the challenges with that come, what do you do in some of those project-based flexible engagements where you need to have that ability to ramp up and down quickly, or bring in niche skill sets, or bring in external advice and expertise that you might not want or need on an ongoing permanent basis. So I think there are some gaps in that, but certainly starting to grow that permanent headcount is an option. It's probably also worth at this point saying that engaging people directly or contractors directly, or engaging them via an agency supply chain, again, it might be that you don't need to change that. That's what you're doing at the moment. You can carry on doing that. Agency supply chain umbrellas work very well. So umbrella would give you that PAYE route for things that if you're going to move from a contractor PSC model to umbrella. From an agency point of view, you can use an agency supply chain to manage engagement style or supply to engage that both inside and outside. I think they work very comfortably and easy for anything that's inside. It gives some distance from a risk point of view for you as the end client or organisation, and I think it also gives some control and robust process to how that agency supply chain, provided they're vetted properly, how they can manage those deductions. For outside engagements, again, it's perfectly reasonable to still engage agency contractors that are on an outside basis, but there are probably some things that are worth considering in that. I think probably be slightly more careful with that. So just consider, as Richard said, need to share the determination with that supply chain. So the practicalities of that, but also the outcome and result and questions, you need to be able to manage those. It's worth reviewing your contracts as well. So things like clear approach to substitution, direction and control, and some of the bits that Steve highlighted. Can you accommodate output-based payments? So if that's one of the key things you want to move to, that more outcome-based way of working, how's that managed through an agency supply chain? Often they use timesheets and everything's run through time capture, whether that's days, hours. So moving to an outcome-based model, how does that work, and how does that risk flow through that agency supply chain? And also, how do you go about reviewing and updating compliance particularly around the determination? So what was right at the point the determination was made, if that engagement rolls on for 6, 9, 12 months, making sure that you're redoing that determination to make sure you remain compliant and nothing's changed is a good idea in that space. There's a big drive, and there has been a big drive from a solution point of view to move to an SOW type model, and SOW less about the full outsourcing of work packages to a supplier, more about individual contractor engagement under an SOW. I think that's been a significant increase in uptake on that since 2017, and interestingly, really well received in the main by contractors. There's often a view that contractors, they want to work on a time and materials basis and kind of have their cake and eat it, but actually in the main, perfectly happy to move on to outcome-based contracts and back their skill set and experience to deliver the work. I think these type of SOW models can help solve wider problems of contractor spend as well. So move away from that flexible engagement and have more of an outcome-based way of working that is good across your contractor base, but also will spread well into your organisation of permanent engagements as well, where you're saying actually this is about delivery of outcomes, not about how much time you spend on something or how you're doing it. It's about getting to that end point. And it could absolutely have introducing a model like this into your organisation can help retain some of the best people going forward as well, because offering these types of engagements and for those contractors who want to work in that way is going to be a useful attraction tool. That said, it does need good internal governance, so making sure that you have got oversight of the different things that are going on, making sure that you manage change effectively on those contracts. So need to make sure the governance in place, and also just need to make sure that you're on top of all of your contracts and your policies and procedures, and make sure you're not kind of accidentally creating some of these employment relationships in there. So yeah, they're the main ones. I think the other end of the spectrum would be to look at fully outsourcing piece, offshoring, employ consultant models, which do work and can be very effective at managing risk. But I think the don't use a sledgehammer to crack a walnut, I think is what I would say in that space. If you're just looking at some of those models to solve an IR35 query or quandary, then you probably going a bit over the top. I think there are better ways to do that than to look to outsource big chunks of your business. There are certainly wider complications or consequences of doing that. So yeah, lots of different models, and like I said earlier on, the key to any of these is what works for one organisation won't work for another. So these different options are the right answer depending on what question you're asking and how many things like how many PSEs you've got in your business, what type of business you're in, what industry you're in. If there's a wider industry standard or approach that's being inflicted on you to a degree, then you've only got so much decision-making power in there. So lots of different things to consider before you go into those solutions.
Thank you very much, James. That's fantastic. There's two questions for you, James. One from John. You just spoke about statement of work as a potential mitigation option, but what do I need to do to set this up effectively, and what do I need to be wary of?
I think in terms of what you need to do, I think the bluntest answer to what you need to set up effectively is the genuine need to have them in place. If the need is IR35, I would go back and revisit it. If I'm honest, I would look at what is the organisational need to introduce SOW. Does it help you deliver your pieces of work better? Does it help you get access to the right skill sets better? Does it help you drive that cultural change we talked about? Does it help you from a commercial point of view, actually, because you are going to get what you pay for far more effectively? So are they the needs you're looking at? I think if you have those needs, then absolutely. If actually you want to have control over your resources and treat them like employees, then an SOW model is probably not going to help, and if anything, it's probably going to complicate the situation for you from a delivery perspective. I think if you do have those needs, the sorts of things you want to start looking at having within the organisation is a clear way of scoping work and managing those determinations. We always say the determination should come second. So understand what you want, how you want to deliver the work, what's going to happen, what are the key outcomes. And from there, you can then make a determination, because you're making a determination based what you want the reality to be of that particular engagement, and then from that point on you can structure the engagement that way and make sure everything flows consistently through. So effective scoping, the amount of whether it's project scopes or SOW documents we've seen that have one pretty woolly line as a deliverable. I mean, it's up to an organizational point of view whether they're happy with the value for money that will deliver, but from an IR35 point of view, that's probably not going to get you very far. I think a clear contract structure is important. So, defining and making sure you're clear on some of the things that Steve mentioned. So where does right of substitution sit? Mutuality of obligation, whilst not necessarily covered in the CEST Tool, is important to have a clear position on. Dispute resolution is another good one. If you're moving to an outcome-based model, what if things aren't delivered as you want? What happens in that situation? And also that you've got the ability to effectively link commercial terms to outcomes. Following that, I think documenting that in a clear SOW document. So having what are the key deliverables, what are the outcomes, who's responsible for what are the key risks, what's the acceptance criteria for what good looks like. A governance process would be another one, I think, to sit behind that, particularly looking at how you manage change, because that's the big thing. A lot of consulting SOW professional services engagements go off budget and off timeline because of change, and who does the responsibility for that change sit with from a commercial point of view? Who pays for that change? The last one is probably a system, depending on how many of these engagements you're going to have. Some sort of technology solution would be a good thing to look at. So firstly, make sure you have a differential between what you do when you're looking to engage labour, through your recruitment channels, and when you're looking to engage services and organisations, and that would go through your project-based platform or your services-based platform. Give you clear visibility over that and how it's managed. And for what it's worth, there's a bit of a sign off this question. I'd say a lot of those things that I've talked about there aren't actually particularly difficult to set up. I mean, we've done it with a lot of organisations and set these processes up for them. We have template approaches to doing it. It's not tricky to set a lot of this process up. What is tricky is managing the cultural change that comes with it. If you've got big departments or big parts of your organisation that are used to working in a certain way, to break that and change and move to this more outcome-based way of working is significantly trickier than actually putting the process in place. So that might be where you want to look at some external expertise or some external skills to help support that.
Thank you very much, James. And you touched upon systems. So we have a question from Raj, who asks whether you have some examples of where statement of work has been implemented effectively from a system and process perspective.
Yeah, I don't know if Raj asked that. I assume Raj asked that for the last question. So a lot of that is actually covered in what I just said around kind of those elements themselves are not hard to change. So effective systems and processes, there are lots of ways to do it. It's the management of people that's tricky. If all you're doing is making sure that your process reflects the reality of what's already happening, that's fine. You've not got to manage that cultural change. But if you're actually trying to enact a cultural change, that you need to take account of that and the time restraints and difficulty that's wrapped into it. In terms of systems for managing, I know that RBS have had quite a strong case study for how they've done it. They use the SOW module within SAP Fieldglass, I believe, to do that. I don't know enough of the details about it, but I know that that's a case that's quite widely available. So if anyone is a SAP house uses Fieldglass, that's definitely an option from a technology point of view. Unfortunately, in terms of most of the organisations we work with, they use our platform and our solution. So I need to give an overview of what that does, just so people know what good looks like. It is a separate SOW management platform. It is built around the management of projects, so it has that siloed effect for this is a project engagement. This is about engaging services, not labour. It should be able to house all sorts of different types of organisations, so ranging from PSCs, contractors, through to you're fully outsourced. I mean, our platform has the big four on there, so it's really about making that for service providers. You would put all of your project spend through there. You'd be able to capture things like milestones, outcome, project reporting, how you manage and document determinations, how you manage vetting, how you manage the payments and invoicing process. So really everything goes into that place or into that technology platform to make it an effective system to manage your services spend. From our point of view, our PMO team then do a lot of the the support work to ensure the determinations are correct, that they fit with the reality, and we continue to reassess. So I would again make sure that you have something effective internally that does that and provides you that governance. And for what it's worth, this approach that we take works well. So if anyone is looking at moving to an SOW approach and putting contractors or migrating them over onto SOW contractors to make sure that you've got that governance in place, then feel free to reach out and we'll organise a demo of that for you.
Great, thank you very much, James. So that's the core topics and questions covered. We now want to move on to the open Q&A. Just before I do, to give everyone a chance to think some questions for the panel, just a reminder that for everyone that attends, you will get access to the info library and full range of content on the dedicated website for all things IR35. What we're also going to do is send you a survey later this week. Once filled out, you'll get a free diagnostic report. This is a fantastic tool that's been put together by our expert panel you have heard from today, so I really encourage you to fill out the surveys when it comes through. Hopefully this will help you through the changes. So back to the Q&A, we have some questions. Right, so one for Steve Dilley from Simon Walker asks, as a customer of Reed, if you can supply a contractor who is a one-man band trading as a limited company, what are the implications to me?
This one's relatively simple. If you're using Reed technology to supply you with a contractor, as you described there, as one-man band trading as a limited company, the implications for you are Reed will probably ask you for the IR35 status determination. So you'll be viewed as what Richard was talking about as the end client in the legislation, and Reed as the fee payer. So you will make the determination, inform Reed whether it's inside or outside IR35, and then Reed will make the relevant deductions as the fee payer if it falls inside. So yeah, that answers that question. Right. Hopefully.
Thank you very much. And James, another question we have, do you have to be aware whether the limited company has a substitute available to you for you to rely on this?
No, that's not your responsibility. I think the legislation is key as to so that in terms of even the CEST determination itself, is whether you have the ability or the right to reject a substitute. It's not whether the contractor has the capacity or ability to engage a substitute. I think from a checks and balances point of view, you might want to make sure that you're comfortable with things like the vetting is being done on that substitute and those type of things. That's within your gift to be able to contract and make sure that's right. But no, it's not your responsibility to make sure they have a substitute. It's purely around whether you have the right to reject a substitute if for any reason they choose to deploy one.
Great, thank you, James. Steve, one other question for yourself. I'm seeing a lot of organisations blanket all roles inside IR35. As a contractor, is there an opportunity to challenge this at interview?
This is a little bit of a tricky one. Thanks, Matteo. I think it probably, and obviously Richard, jump in if you have anything to add here, but I think it's it depends how they're implementing that blanket decision. So if they're taking the decision to not want to have PSCs as part of their supply chain, so they're saying we don't want to engage with a PSC because we find that this legislation is too risky. So the only routes for temporary resource we're gonna offer are X, whether that's PAYE or umbrella or anything else. So that's perfectly within the rules. So they're allowed to do that. If they've said all PSCs will be inside IR35, and if you're applying for this role as a PSC, you'll be deemed inside IR35. What you'll be able to do is ask them for the status determination statement. So to say, how did you determine that? And if it's suitable, you would be able to challenge the decision. So within the new legislation, there is an appeals process. So that organisation would need to respond within 30 days. Clearly, I think you put in your question there, challenge this at interview. So it might be up to you in terms of how that relationship is and whether that's the right way to go. You might decide actually this isn't the role for me, depending on how well you think that challenge might go at the interview, because obviously they're under no obligation to kind of take you on. So yeah, that was, hopefully that answers the question. Do you have anything to add, Richard, there?
No, I think that answers it perfectly. I mean, basically the right is to challenge your own individual status determination, not the business's policy on whether they engage limited companies or not. So I think the only thing to add probably is just it's important to find out probably before you go to an interview on what basis the client would consider engaging you, so that you don't turn up and find out that they won't actually engage you as a limited company.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. Richard, that leads me to you with a question. Have HMRC taken action against anyone under this yet? And if so, what happened and what did they do?
So, so obviously the legislation came into the public sector in April 2017, and since then nothing's been taken to court. And perhaps that's not surprising, because it's very unlikely that would end up in a court. So you can't really imagine that HMRC would actually take a public sector organisation to court, and it would be settled before that. About this time last year, there was a case that came up in the press around NHS Digital, and they'd used the CEST test, and HMRC challenged their use of the CEST test, and as a result of that, they did end up with a tax bill, but there was no case from that. That was kind of settled between them. So yeah, there's been nothing really. Any other cases in the public sector all seem to relate back to prior to April 2017, before the rules changed. So yeah, there's nothing really to mention on that side.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Richard. And one more for you, Richard. Simon asks that he may have missed it, but what does PSC stand for?
So it's a personal services company. So it's effectively generally a limited company started up by an individual, perhaps a couple of individuals, for their own use, really for contracting through. But it's a business, and it's quite complicated, the way it's determined. There's no clear definition of it, but generally it's regarded as being a single person business, where you've got one director who owns the majority of the business.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I don't see any additional questions, so that will bring us to the end of our time slot and the end of our session today. Thank you all so much for joining. On behalf of the panel, we really do hope you found this content useful and that you continue to receive value from the content on the website I've been telling everyone. We really are excited about this, and we think it will deliver genuine value for many of you listening today. Like I said, please keep an eye out for the follow-ups and check out the website as part of this follow-up for plenty of further details. Stay safe and have a great day, everyone. Thank you very much.